Since their first introduction into hospital in Aberdeen in 1982, MRI scanners have revolutionised the world of medicine. They allow us to look inside the human body in amazing clarity and detail.
I think it took a while for us to realise just how really valuable it was going to be.
So as far as I remember, in total, we looked at about 1,000, we had about 1,000 patient referrals on it.
There was quite a lot of resistance to anyone bothering to invent it because they said it won't work. Quite a few famous people said it wouldn't work.
Incredibly important, absolutely incredibly important. I mean, the number of lives saved by MRIs, I don't know what it is, but it must run into millions. And Mark I was absolutely crucial in that development. You really can't underestimate how important it was.
In the late 70s, there were several teams around the world working to develop the technique of nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI as it became known. The team in Aberdeen that would ultimately be the first to develop a fully functional whole-body scanner was led by Professor John Mallard.
It was when I was in London that I became very impressed with the use of electron magnetic resonance for helping to elucidate the structure of hemoglobin. And that made me wonder if magnetic resonance could be used at all on living tissues. Round about 1967 time, an American called Damadian used nuclear magnetic resonance, and he found that there were differences from tumours' nuclear magnetic resonance signals than from normal rat tissues.
And started working, of all things, on ultrasound, the technology, which wasn't very advanced in those days. So I spent about 3 years on that. Meanwhile, I had 2 research students who were interested in magnetic resonance, nuclear magnetic resonance. I remember doing our very first sort of imaging experiment, which was a set of 4 capillary tubes pushed into a coil, and they had different concentrations of copper sulfate solution, and that worked quite well. We could image the 4 tubes and the one different in that. So that told us that imaging was really a possibility.
Part of the history of MRI in Aberdeen is that Jim Hutchison built a desktop scanner, literally a desktop scanner, using a permanent magnet, which was quite small in size, but big enough to take a mouse. And one of the early scans of a mouse was actually of a dead mouse. That was because images at that time took hours to collect. This was several years before the spin warp method had been invented, and the image was collected probably over a period of at least an hour. And then the data were analysed, which probably took another hour at least to do, and the image was produced.
It was printed out on a university printer as a set of numbers in a sort of square. And I had to go around all these numbers, colouring them in. the sort of things you do in early stages of development. It's quite amazing.
During an MRI scan, you lie in a strong magnetic field and radio waves are pulsed through your body. Roughly 60% of the human body is made up of water molecules, and when you lie in the magnetic field generated by the scanner, the protons in these water molecules all line up in the same direction, in the same way that a magnet can pull the needle of a compass. Radio waves are then pulsed through the body, knocking the protons out of alignment. But when the radio waves are turned off, the protons realign again, and in doing so emit tiny radio signals. It is these signals an MRI scanner detects and uses to create an image, as they provide information about their location in the body and can distinguish the different types of tissue in the body, as the protons in different types of tissue realign at different speeds, and so each produces a distinctive signal. This difference in the speed at which protons realign is called the relaxation time.
Once the mouse image had been obtained, and which showed some pathology from the differences in T1, which was, of course, a very exciting result. I mean, that must have been a eureka moment. John indeed saw the bigger picture, and whereas the scientists might just have been content with building a version that was twice as big, or still a kind of desktop but twice as big, John immediately thought, okay, we've imaged a mouse, let's image a human.
Now there were other people trying to do it, and to some extent they got the limelight. They were going up, they were first imaging fingers, then wrists, then arms, and so on, gradually working up in size. But I knew very well from all our nuclear medicine radioactive isotope work that in a hospital you've got to have something that can image anywhere in the body, the liver, the kidneys, the brain, and so on. So whilst they were publishing papers on imaging fingers, we were struggling like mad to get a whole body machine working, and that wasn't done until 1980. So altogether it took 23 years. I think it's not generally realised that it took 23 years from conceiving the idea of having a magnetic resonance imaging machine to actually getting one and making it work on a whole body.
The thing with NMR imaging or MRI is that scale is really important. It's much easier to do things on a small scale. Not just doubling the size makes it twice as difficult, doubling the size makes it, a power of 2 more difficult, 8 times more difficult or whatever, I'm just guessing, but it's considerably more difficult to build a scanner that's capable of imaging a whole body than it was of imaging a small object like a bit of fruit or even a human head.
There were about 6 or 8 people in the team, but Jim Hutchison was the main leading one actually working on it, and I was just kicking them all up at the pants and getting the money. Of course, all the money came from the MRC. There was nothing from the university, although they claim it now, but it was all from the MRC. I spent half my time on aeroplanes going up and down to London, trying to get grants and whatnot. It was hard work.
I mean, the budget was just peanuts. I think the figure was £30,000 to include both staff and magnet and stuff. I think Glyn told me that was worth about £150,000 in normal modern prices. That is a complete joke, doing a project like that and that money. It's just ridiculous. But when you're young and foolish, you just get on with it. Yeah.
It was round about this time, I think it was about 77, that Bill Edelstein came into our group, and he was a really bright and go-for-it chap.
Bill was in Aberdeen for 3 years, just for 3 years, from about, I think, August or September of 1977 until the same time of year in 1980 we left. We went to the United States around July, August 1980. He and Jim Hutchison, very different people, very different backgrounds, and yet from Bill's point of view, he felt that it was a very good partnership, as it were. He had the very highest regard for the work Jim had already done in Aberdeen, and of what he learned from Jim, and from the way they could combine their particular talents and work together.
Jim Hutchison is probably the most able scientist I've ever known, and certainly the most able scientist I've ever worked with. I mean, Jim is absolutely incredibly knowledgeable about, not just about magnetic resonance, about electronics, and you name it, Jim knows about it. But he's also probably the most modest person I've ever met. So he's absolutely not one to blow his own trumpet in any way. But I always enjoyed working with Jim because you knew that if you run into any problem with the technology or theoretical aspect of the experiment or anything, and you asked Jim, he would think, yes, I think, why not try this? And inevitably that would probably work. Either that, or you'd say to Jim, I'm working on this idea, but I'm not sure about this aspect. What do you think about that? And Jim would fetch out a lab book from 5 years previous, and well, actually, I thought about that. And he'd written it all down and done some calculations and simulations on it already.
He was a person who just loved problems, who loved the whole idea. I think this was his whole approach to life, more than just his science, but he loved grappling with a problem. He found the process of problem solving, I think, as fulfilling and thrilling, or as the end result, as achieving what he was aiming to achieve.
Well, we had to build big radio frequency coils, and they sort of get wrapped around the patient. Well, they're actually permanently on the thing, but they go around you, effectively, and you have to... Well, we were just using central heating tubing for it. So it's cheap. It's quite hands-on, building stuff like that. And obviously people built more sophisticated gadgets, digital circuits and radio receivers and amplifiers. But there was quite a lot of basic engineering going on. It was actually built on a budget. Very much so. A real Aberdeen scanner.
In fact, the magnet arrived without any water cooling, and after running for about an hour, it was hot enough to fry an egg on. So that was one of the places where Eddie came in to make a whole set of water cooling plates around the place. When we first installed it, it was plagued with leaks, water dripping everywhere. But it eventually worked properly. kept the magnet operational.
Yeah, Eddie's an incredibly creative bloke. Just got on and built a scanner. I mean, that was the first whole-body scanner in the world, built by Eddie Stevenson. That's pretty a claim to fame, is it not?
Nowadays, people wouldn't work the way we worked before. Basically, it was a team. I mean, little Jimmy would say, like maybe in an evening, and I would like to get so-and-so for morning or get us done or blah, blah, blah. And I'd say, okay, get done for you. And we worked as a team.
Bill had a very high regard for Jim's abilities. They worked into the night many times. I mean, it was a strange, in a way, it was a strange life for me, because we were newly married, and it was like, is this what it's like? And you laugh at this. I think I was an NMR widow kind of thing, talking about golf widows.
I knew at the time that the physicists who I worked with in nuclear medicine, I knew that some of their colleagues were developing a new scanning technique called NMR. And it must have been about July or August of 1980 that Bill Edelstein, who worked with Jim Hutchison, came across and showed me the image that we're actually looking at here. And this was a picture that had been made through Linda Eastwood, one of the PhD students, through her chest. And he said to me, "Isn't this exciting?" And I said, "Yeah, it's very exciting, but there's a lot of movement artifact due to the heart. Once we get rid of that, then we may be able to use it clinically."
One of the biggest challenges facing the team was how to generate an image of something that moves, such as the heart and lungs. The Fourier transform process, or spin warp as it became known in Aberdeen, was developed by Jim Hutchison and Bill Edelstein.
And the breakthrough was in April 1980.
That, in fact, was us, Bill and I, working well into the late evening, trying to get things together. The computer and things were in a completely different room. It was about 100 yards away, and with a long lengths of cable stretched between them. And trying out various things, and things didn't work. Finally, I decided to get into the machine and be a guinea pig at about 1 o'clock in the morning. And I was so exhausted, I just fell asleep in the machine, which I think helped with image stability. I wasn't moving at all. And Bill was through in the computer room collecting the image. He suddenly comes in, his arms up. "Jim, we've done it." So that was that. And that, of course, is the result. It looks dreadful by today's standards, but it was the first.
And it was the team here that did the breakthrough with the technique that was nicknamed spin warp, to freeze that motion so that you could form a proper image in spite of the motion taking place in the patient. And that was our big breakthrough, really, in April 1980. It's a fundamental part of nearly all of every machine. modified, of course, and improved and so on and so forth, but it's still basically there.
The other thing about the technique is it was much less prone to what we call image artifact than other methods. By image artifacts, I mean, like a TV picture that's gone wrong, stripes and squiggles, and medical imaging's prone to artifacts. And one of the biggest artifacts is caused by movement of anything. So not just people waving their hands around, but involuntary movement like the heart beating. So spin warp was pretty good at not being upset by these image artifacts. So it had loads and loads of pluses. And immediately, instead of Aberdeen just being one of not that many groups actually, a few groups in the world, all of a sudden we had a scanner which could scan the whole body.
The name spin warp was actually invented by my wife, Meg. Star Trek was all the rage as a program in those days, so they had warp factor and everything in it. I wasn't sure what I was going to call the method. She suggested spin warp, and it really took on as a name. And we patented the method, and that was one of the most successful patents ever to come out of Aberdeen. That has kept me going into my old age quite nicely.
It's still, the fundamental principles used in that method are still standard imaging method everywhere in every MRI scanner throughout the world, because it's a very efficient technique and because it's a technique which is robust. In other words, it tends to work even in equipment which isn't great.
So it was an interesting scanner to use. The good thing about all home-built equipment like that is it tends to be very flexible, because you're not constrained by what a manufacturer has put in and locks that they might put in to stop users doing crazy things. If it's a home-built scanner, you can do anything you like. There's nobody to tell you not to do it.
Other techniques involved, say, just collecting the signal from a single point and moving that point around in order to form an image. So in other words, it's a bit like painting a picture just one spot at a time. It's incredibly slow. Other techniques did a line at a time, called line scanning. But spin warp took the signal from the entire slice simultaneously. Basically, it was a big leap in terms of scanning methods, and I think it worked virtually first time.
He would say the people who succeed through luck. He always thought it was, he'd just been very fortunate to land into something that could develop in that way. And the idea of perseverance and persistence and just never giving up. He knew that was his strength.
I'm on the clinical side, right? The scientists and the magnificent brains were doing different things. But John Mallard quite rightly knew that unless we showed its value clinically, it would perish.
It's very good at imaging soft tissue, and by that I mean, ordinary things like muscle and the soft organs like the heart and the liver and the brain and so on. Because it is imaging the water content of the tissue effectively, or the hydrogen atoms in the water. whereas X-rays are good at imaging bones and harder things like cartilage. And so it complements CT scanning rather nicely.
Well, we were all hopping in and out, you know. But we had to do that before they would let us put a patient in, you see. We had to say, well, we know it's safe because we're still here, we haven't gone mad, you know. We haven't fallen to bits or anything. But we did it for a long time, you see. It was from April until August the 26th. The medics didn't like the idea very much at all, if the truth be admitted.
And the other thing about it is it doesn't involve radiation, so no radiation dose. And in the late 70s, early 80s, that wasn't particularly a concern. I mean, that has become more of a concern over the years. And modern CT scanners do deliver quite a hefty radiation dose compared with earlier scanners. So, I mean, basically that's why MRI is considered, you know, to be a modern and a useful technique. It complements the other techniques.
It's funny that later on, MRI showed that I had spine work. I have a scoliosis in my upper spine. The first time I saw that, I thought, oh, there's something wrong with this image. It's distorting the image quite a bit. I wonder what's causing that. Then we put somebody else into the image, and it was straight on. So we ended up diagnosing myself before we had any patients there.
We didn't suffer any effects from going in the machine, you know. We didn't know whether there were any effects to start with. So, but there didn't seem to be any problems. And the very first patient went in on August the 26th, 1980.
So this was very exciting, and Professor Mallard then said to me, could I help by getting some patients to see if indeed the NMR theory was true. And the NMR theory that we were working to was that it had been stated by Raymond Damadian in the United States that the relaxation time, which is the measurement that an NMR machine makes, was significantly different in malignant disease than in normal tissue. And his experiments had all been done in a test tube. So once we had made certain that the technique of putting somebody into a strong magnetic field and pulsing radio signals through them was safe, I spoke with one or two of my clinical colleagues in the hospital, especially Dr. Christopher Smith, Dr. Chris Smith, who agreed that we could look at a patient who had malignant disease. And we knew that the poor man had a large cancer in his gullet, and the man consented to be the first patient to ever be scanned by MRI. And when we scanned him, we clearly demonstrated that the relaxation time of the tumours within his liver were very different from the relaxation time that we'd found in normal livers.
I don't have a picture of our first patient. We've simply got images of the first patient. He was a fairly old man. He'd probably be in his 60s. Again, he was listed as a terminal cancer case. And in his case, it was really a question of, can we see a difference from normal here? And what we saw was a vast difference in not only his liver, which was shot through with cancer, and his spleen, which was abnormally large. But we discovered a secondary tumour in his spine, actually in one of the discs of his spine, which hadn't been found.
So that was quite a breakthrough on August the 26th, 1980. And once we'd done one patient, well then of course the patient started coming over. The machine was in the building next to this one. All the patients had to be brought over from the hospital. I've got a lovely picture of Dr. Smith. He was bringing most of the patients in deep snow, pushing a patient on a trolley from the hospital over to the building where the Mark I machine was.
The snow picture is a representative picture that was made probably in early 1981, once we had started to look at other patients in the hospital. And in those days, the porters were not allowed to take patients from the hospital to the medical school. So it fell to me to be the porter, which was very nice because it gave me an opportunity of meeting the patient, to talk to them as we went across and explain a little bit about what we were going to do. So it was a nice introduction to each patient. But that picture was certainly in the January, February of 1981.
Because it was proven to be so successful, we couldn't get on it anymore because it was being used all the time for patients. And we had to modify the soap store, the medical school soap store, which was in our building, to be the waiting room for the patient before they went into the machine.
Well, Mallard wrote me a letter one day, and he said, Eddie, do you realise that with you building the MRI machine, there is 1.5 million people per day being scanned on the MRI, which amazed me, really. But you never think that what you do, it's a machine, you build it, it's in use, fine.
It's had a massive impact on patients in terms of there are diseases that we can see on MRI images that we could never diagnose before. They would be a diagnosis of exclusion. So we can now make a positive diagnosis based on MRI findings in many more patients than we could in the past. And we can use MRI to sensitively monitor their disease and the response to treatment in a much more sensitive way than we could ever do before.
So today we have techniques that look not only at the anatomy of the body but also at the function of the body. So with functional MRI we're now able to look at people's brains while they perform different tasks, and we see how the different parts of the brain are highlighted when the different tasks are performed.
I do remember being very, very excited. Roughly 6 weeks after we put in the very first patient, we imaged multiple sclerosis, and that was the first ever image of the damage to the brain by the disease. The disease dissolves away the fatty sheath on the outside of the nerve fibres in the brain, and that changes the magnetic properties, so you can actually see where the disease is damaging the brain, and you get white blobs all over the image. I remember being very excited about that.
And within 2 years of Jim Hutchison and Prof. Mallard producing these images, we had Dr. Besson in psychiatry looking at the brain and looking at the effects of alcohol on the brain. So back in 1981, using this, almost Heath Robinson-looking machine, we have a man who is studying the beginnings of our understandings of the development of dementia. I mean, this is a nice little thing that the patient came and had pictures through the front of the pictures of the eyes disappeared. Right? Why should there be no eyes? And you go and look at it, she's heavily made up with mascara. So we said, take off your mascara and we'll do it again, and the eyes appear. Right? You then go and you phone up Max Factor and these people and ask them what they put in the mascara. And yeah, there are iron oxides and cobalt and all kinds of things. The cheap mascara is ground up in just iron rolling iron, whereas the expensive stuff that the ladies buy has been done in very much better quality steel rollers, so you don't get any little bits of iron left in the. Right? But to this day, patients are asked to take off their mascara because of that. Well, you can't say to a lady, that cheap mascara you've got on.
So when our son was born in 1970, at the end of 1978, and our son Arthur was born in Aberdeen Maternity Hospital here, just very close to where Bill was working. So in those days, they kept the mother in the hospital for a week when a baby was born. Bill would come and visit me, not at the official visiting hours, but he would put on a white coat. And I would see him come in the door. This would be, in those days, in a large ward with maybe about 6 people. And as I say, not the visiting hours, and some very strict ward sisters in charge. And I would sort of cringe when he would come in. But this was the risk taker in Bill. It was like, you do this till somebody stops you, sort of thing. And so he would come in and visit me and the new baby. So on the day when we were going home, he came in the Mini to pick me up and got into the car. No car seats for babies in those days. So I was holding the baby. I was sitting in the back seat of the Mini. And we're driving out of the hospital gates. And he said, I just want to stop at the lab for 5 minutes to check on an experiment. There was snow on the ground. This is early December. And I'm thinking, this is your newborn son. He hasn't been home, and we've got to stop at the lab. So we parked on the street, and I'm thinking 5 minutes is going to be 20 minutes. He rushed in, he did whatever he had to do, and he was out in a couple of minutes. So he was at that time, what he said was what happened. And then I thought afterwards, well, I suppose the machine was his first baby. You know, this new child, he hadn't had a chance to find out what it was like to have a real live child, but the machine came first that day. After that, I would say that the child got his due place.
Well, somebody walked in. A young bloke had been recruited by Frank to come across and get the scan because Frank Smith was out in the hospital and he was approaching people and asking whether they'd be willing to have an MRI scan as a research thing. Anyway, this chap rolled up. He's quite a young bloke. And he had to walk across from the main hospital out across the car park into this sort of rather, non-clinical looking, more of a science labby sort of environment rather than a hospital environment. He walked along the corridor and he turned into the scanner and took one look at it and said in no uncertain terms, missing out the expletives, I'm nae getting in that thing. Turned around and walked back out again. Because it was rather a Heath Robinson looking gadget. I can understand where he was coming from. I suppose the remarkable thing is that most people were willing to get into it.
The scanner control computer was called a mini computer, but it was an absolutely enormous device, took up the whole of one wall of the lab. It probably had, well, definitely had much less computing power than any mobile phone these days.
Well, we then realised we couldn't do any research on the old one because it was being used in patients all the time. So we had to build a second machine, and the Medical Research Council would no longer support us on this. They said, we've given you all the money to do it and make the breakthrough. We're not interested anymore. You've got to, well, if you want to build any more, you've got to get the money yourself. And there was nobody that was willing to give us £283,000 that we needed to build Mark II to go into the hospital. I happened to be invited to give a lecture in Japan, in Maebashi, in November 1980, and I showed some of our early pictures. So I was then besieged by all the major Japanese companies, Toshiba, Asahi. They were all trying to get all our know-how for nothing, you know. And in the end, it was the Asahi Chemical Industry Company of Tokyo that gave us the $283,000 to build the Mark II, which was the first hospital, the first machine that actually went into the ARI, into the hospital. And they wanted all the know-how, of course, so they sent 4 engineers, and probably Peter Sharp will remember having these 4 Japanese people in the department, and every day they sent telegrams, messages home with all the details, all the know-how and everything, you know.
1981-82, when Jim Hutchison and I were being invited to talk in different places around the world, there was a deal of skepticism, but there was also a great deal of a great number of people who could see the potential and would say, where do I see it going? And I said that within 40 years I believed that this would be up and challenging conventional radiology, and that hospitals would have separate MRI machines for the brain, for the heart, for the musculoskeletal system, and indeed that is what has happened today.
I think I gave you an analogy between, you know, how that original scanner compares with a modern scanner by saying it's a bit like comparing a Wright brothers biplane versus a modern jetliner. You know, things have moved an awful, things have moved remarkably quickly in those intervening years. The reason that things have moved so quickly is because MRI is such a widely accepted technique. It's used in hospitals throughout the world.
But in 1982, the book was produced in the United States by Drs. Bradley and Dr. Stark. And Dr. Stark said to me, he says, every time I have a good idea for a new area to look at, I go and look it up and I find that the Aberdeen team was there before me. So I think that this was a very significant piece of equipment. It was a significant first, and it landed in a medical school where there were people thinking in the right direction, that maybe CT scan was coming, but this was going to offer more than just anatomy, it was going to offer the physiology.
And I think it was by about 1987 or so, it was a public scandal. All the leading hospitals in the States had an MRI, all the leading hospitals in Japan had an MRI, in Germany had an MRI, you know, and in Britain we only had about 6. It was pathetic. The National Health Service just did not take any interest in it. So because of all that, all the know-how and all the manufacturing and everything was never done in Britain. So it's a typical story. You develop something in Britain, you make it work, it's a superb step forward, But America gets all the benefit, Germany gets all the benefit, Japan gets all the benefit. It makes me weep when I think about it.
There were very few MRI scanners in the UK until the early 1990s. It was a big disappointment because that meant younger people in the team found it really quite difficult to get jobs. I mean, Bill went to the USA, Glenn Johnson went to Queen's Square, the Institute of Neurology, which is a pretty famous place, and then went to America. Linda Eastwood was another early team member. She went to work in the States.
As far as the clinical impact, MRI covers almost all medical specialties, from psychiatry, cardiology, oncology, orthopedics. I don't think there's any medical specialty that MRI doesn't touch or impact in some way.
Doing MRI scans, I'm sure if you asked your friends and family around, whether you're bound to know more than one person that's had an MRI scan.
Yeah, I think it was very satisfying to him that he'd been working on something that had such a positive, place in the world, as it were.
I don't know what the market is these days, but literally thousands of scanners being sold every year, and each scanner's worth of the order of $1 million. So you do the maths, I mean, you're talking about $1 billion industry, and that's just the hardware.
Every single MRI scanner in the world that's running now is using techniques and technologies that were developed in the medical physics building here. Every single one uses the basic fundamental imaging tool that was developed by Jim Hutchison.
To a large extent, it gave me a reason for living. Not for being around.
How do you mean?
Well, just to know that I'd started things along with Bill Edelstein. And it just made me feel happy that way.
Any new machine developed these days seem to be very much more done by big commercial companies rather than individual little teams of groups of half-mad scientists,
It's impossible to compare one scientific breakthrough with another, or the impact that one medical development has had over another. But the one thing that most people who work in the medical and research sectors would agree is that the development of magnetic resonance imaging undoubtedly changed contemporary medical practice for the better, moving it into a new era and unlocking new doors. And a key part of this development and an important part of that story was, as Professor Mallard said, a small team of half-mad scientists.